Aaron Amaral of the Tempest Collective. You're listening to Counterpunch Radio. We will be right back. And we are back chatting with Aaron Amaral of the Tempest Collective and the Ukraine Solidarity Network. Of course, there's so much to discuss. I could go on for hours and hours and hours, as I have been for months and months and months. But let's talk about how we got to this point a little bit, because I think it's going to be, well, for some, I think it's instructive to understand the history, but I think it's also instructive to understand how we get to a better place than we are right now. So I guess I'll just ask the very controversial question first. Syria. What role did the divides on the left over the issue of Syria play in shaping the same divides that we seem to see reflected in Ukraine?
I mean, in many ways, it's exactly the precursor to these discussions. That the kind of it's always I mean, it's always been the case. Well, let me back up. The failure from the get from by sections of the left to recognize the dynamic in Syria, to recognize the moment of popular revolt and rebellion against the Assad regime, and to see it only as a kind of so-called colored revolution, or was another example of a kind of erasure of the agency of a people actively rebelling against an authoritarian regime, in a context in which representing the tail end of a series of important massive revolts against kind of neoliberal dictatorship that we know as the Arab Spring. And from that starting point, the failure to kind of have as your starting point and your perspective the kind of the questions of from below, essentially the questions of that popular revolt, and to see that the fight in Syria solely and always as one of kind of geopolitics of states, maneuvering against one another, is precisely the kind of mistake that we're seeing here. And so, there's always been, going back to your previous question, there's always been sections of the left, for decades, that have had that perspective, that their starting point has always been one of geopolitics, and has always thought that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Wait, is that the framing? That those states that oppose the U.S. empire were objectively should objectively be held as allies. There's always been a section of the left that thought in those terms. However, what we're seeing now, I think, in the concrete sort of situation of the Ukraine, are broader sections of the left confused by the question, where they don't may not necessarily see deny um, uh, the authoritarian government of Putin, or deny the reality of the Russian invasion, but then effectively stop and refuse to take the next step and say, look, we have to defend the rights of Ukrainians to defend themselves. Um, and therefore stand back from that important recognition of the need for solidarity. Um, so yeah, the situation in Syria was an early precursor to precisely this: the failure of the Bush the Bush two gambit to kind of ensure the unipolar dominance of the United States by essentially a takeover and a dominance of Southwest Asia to control the oil. The failure of that gambit in the 2000s essentially opened up the rise of this in the kind of in the beginning of shows of weakness of the U.S. empire, the rise of this kind of asymmetrical multipolar imperial world that we're starting to have to grapple with now. Syria is an early example of it, but there have been others as well.
Yeah, and I think Syria also demonstrates another principle is probably not the right word, but maybe framework for understanding Russia that I've put forward many times before. I wrote a whole article in Counterpunch just a couple of weeks after the invasion, the Russian invasion in February of last year, and that is that Russia and Putin have essentially internalized and replicated a Russian version of neocon thinking, right? That much of what Russia has done in Ukraine does follow the U.S. playbook in Iraq, right? Substitute Al Qaeda for Azov Battalion, substitute WMD for U.S. biolabs and a new non-existent Ukrainian nuclear program, and you got yourself a neocon war in Ukraine. And in fact, what you see is also that many of those that sort of parrot Russia's talking points have also, to a large degree, internalized a lot of neocon thinking, a lot of war on terror thinking. And I think the war on terror thinking was particularly relevant in Syria, where everyone who opposed Assad was just a terrorist. Simple, right?
Right.
That you don't have to then dig a little deeper and look into, well, okay, yeah, there are these factions that are getting arms from these sources, but there are also these factions that have been involved from the very beginning, and you have to be right. So you have to do a little bit of work. And Syria was a complicated conflict, and there were a lot of regional actors involved, especially once Turkey got involved, Russia got involved, Iran was involved, the US was involved. So there were many things at play in Syria, and in some ways, Ukraine is actually a lot simpler.
Yeah, absolutely. And the throwing up of one's hands and sort of saying it's impossible to know, or it's all propaganda, or the kind of coming to sort of simplistic solutions is very redolent of what we saw in Syria. I mean, look, it's important to say that nobody is denying a kind of reality of what Zelensky is, or a kind of predominance of a kind of particular kind of neoliberal politic that's dominant in Ukraine, the dominance of a right wing politic in Ukraine. Nobody's saying that that's not true. But we are saying that that does not define the entire situation. To believe otherwise is essentially, to not be doing the work that you're talking about, to not be seeing the existence of a left in Ukraine, the existence of trade union movements, the existence of national minorities who are also fighting for against the Russian invasion, et cetera, on and on and on. So the idea that somehow we can't do this work, or it's all propaganda, or is incredibly disheartening and needs to be struggled against. And yeah, it's incredibly complex, and it's only going to get more complex. Unfortunately, in this world, I was watching your discussion. I think from a discussion you were involved with yesterday, talking about the kind of role of Israel, and just by way of an example, and the kind of duplicitous kind of role that Israel is seeking to play, in Ukraine and vis-a-vis Russia, with whom they have a long-standing alliance. It's incredibly challenging, especially given the kind of the sort of now the sort of incredibly reactionary nature of the Israeli government. Um, but it's a concrete example of why this type of solidarity is important, and calling attention to the fact that there are other forces on the ground in Ukraine. The comrades in the social movement in Ukraine with whom we're in touch, have released statements in the past in defense of the Palestinian in defense of the Palestinian movement, in opposition to the Zionist state. There are actual forces on the ground there that also recognize this complexity, and there's the possibility of building that solidarity. Uh, so, but yeah, it requires work on our part, but that work is possible, and fortunately, there are people on the ground there in Ukraine and in Russia and in other parts that we should be talking to and listening to. Um, you know, uh, January 19th, this Thursday, I think the 19th to the 24th, there's a call coming out of Russia for International Days of Action, anti-fascist action, in defense of calling for the freedom of political prisoners in Russia. There's a left in Russia too that has an analysis and has things to say, and that is actively campaigning to 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 end this war, and we should be magnifying their voices too,
Absolutely. That's an
because this is a
important.
disaster. Yeah, this is a disaster for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. And that's an important point you just mentioned. It's something that I've brought up many times before. If you heard my interview with Boris Kagarlitsky on this podcast, then we've talked a lot about the fact that people in the West don't even comprehend that Russia has a social society, that there is a politics internal to Russia, that there are movements and there are contradictions and there are dynamics that have to be understood. And one of the points Boris made, and I thought was a good one, was that in fact an argument could be made that most of the reasons for Putin's launching of this war were domestic in nature and had nothing to do with NATO. But that's a discussion for another day. We have limited number of minutes left, so let me just move on. And I guess I'm sort of circling back to something we talked about earlier, and that is what is it that we're demanding here? What is it that the Ukraine Solidarity Network has written? What is it calling for? Because in calling for Ukrainians to get arms from wherever they may, it is obviously implying the elephant in the room, that is getting arms from the United States and from NATO. So the real question then becomes, if you support, as I do, the right of Ukrainian people to defend themselves and to have self determination, which means to be able to get the weapons necessary to fend off the Russian invaders. If you believe in that, then the obvious question, if we're responsible, that we have to ask is, how do we know when is enough? How does it stop? How does this spigot turn off once it's been turned on? Is that even possible? And do those who say that it is impossible have a point?
We need to step back and think about who we are and what is it that we actually are able to control. The Ukraine Solidarity Network is not in existence in the first instance to campaign for increased armament or increased Pentagon budget. Not at all. We defend the rights of Ukrainians to get arms from wherever it can. We recognize that in this circumstance, that means importantly the United States and other NATO countries, and we're not going to campaign to stop that. But that issue is not our primary concern. There are sections of the left that think our primary job is to stop that, and we think that's crazy. And that's goes against our fundamental principle of defending the right of national self determination. But our primary goal is not to be campaigning for arms.